The sun hung low in the sky as a group of 5 friends, Ethan, Mark, Sarah, Lisa, and Tom, set out on their weekend hiking trip. The forest they chose was known for its dense, untamed wilderness and its lack of foot traffic, making it the perfect escape from their hectic lives. Equipped with backpacks, tents, and a sense of adventure, they followed a narrow trail deeper into the woods, eager to leave the noise of the city behind. The trail wound through towering trees, whose canopies formed a natural roof, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. The scent of pine and earth filled the air, and the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls created a peaceful soundtrack. They walked in companionable silence, each absorbed in the beauty around them. As the afternoon wore on, the group decided to take a break near a small, crystal-clear stream. They sat on the moss-covered rocks, chatting and laughing, enjoying the serene environment. Ethan, always the leader, pulled out a map and traced their planned route, discussing the best spot to set up camp for the night. Just as they were about to resume their hike, a faint, high-pitched sound caught Lisa's attention. She frowned, listening intently. The sound was faint but unmistakable, a child's cry for help. She alerted the others, and they all fell silent, straining to hear. The cries grew louder and more desperate, echoing through the trees. Driven by a sense of urgency, they abandoned their planned route and followed the sound, moving swiftly but carefully through the underbrush. The cries led them to a small clearing, where they found a young girl, no older than 8, huddled by a fallen tree. Her clothes were dirty and torn, and her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Ethan approached the girl slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. The girl looked up, her wide eyes filled with terror. She was trembling, clearly traumatized. Ethan knelt beside her, trying to offer comfort, while the rest of the group formed a protective circle around them. The girl, whose name was Emily, clung to Ethan, her small hands gripping his shirt tightly. Through broken, sob-filled sentences, she told them about a man who had taken her family. Her parents and brother had been camping nearby when the man attacked. She had managed to escape, but she didn't know what had happened to the others. The group was shocked and horrified by her story. They exchanged worried glances, realizing the gravity of the situation. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming and peaceful just hours before, now felt sinister and threatening. They knew they couldn't leave Emily alone, but they were also aware that staying in one place made them vulnerable. Ethan decided they needed to set up camp nearby to regroup and plan their next move. As they set up their tents and built a fire, the shadows grew longer and the temperature dropped. The forest around them was alive with the sounds of night, but the usual comfort of those noises now felt ominous. They took turns comforting Emily, giving her food and water, and trying to keep her warm. Mark and Tom, both skilled in outdoor survival, scouted the area to ensure there were no immediate threats. They found no sign of the mysterious man, but the presence of an unknown predator weighed heavily on their minds. The group sat around the campfire discussing their options. They could attempt to hike out of the forest immediately, but that posed its own risks in the dark. Alternatively, they could wait until morning, when they'd have better visibility and a clearer idea of where they were going. Ultimately, they decided to stay put for the night, keeping a close watch on their surroundings. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, the group settled into an uneasy vigil. The once comforting sounds of the forest now seemed to hide unseen dangers, and every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves put them on edge. They took turns keeping watch, each hour feeling longer than the last. Emily, exhausted from her ordeal, eventually fell asleep in Sarah's arms. The others, however, found sleep elusive. They sat in silence, listening to the night, and wondering what horrors might be lurking just beyond the reach of their firelight. The discovery of Emily had turned their adventure into a nightmare, and they knew they had to find a way to get her to safety before it was too late. Dawn broke slowly over the forest, casting an eerie, pale light through the dense canopy. The group, exhausted from their sleepless night, gathered around the dying embers of their campfire. Emily clung to Sarah, her eyes wide with fear and fatigue. Ethan, who had taken the last watch, stood and stretched, trying to shake off the lingering dread that had settled in his bones. They quickly packed up their camp, knowing they couldn't afford to linger any longer. The forest, which had felt menacing in the dark, now seemed almost oppressive in the daylight. Every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs set their nerves on edge. They decided to follow the trail back towards the main road, hoping to find help as soon as possible. Ethan led the way, map in hand, while Tom brought up the rear, constantly glancing over his shoulder. Sarah walked with Emily, keeping the girl close and trying to reassure her with quiet, soothing words. Mark and Lisa kept their eyes on the dense underbrush, alert for any sign of movement. The journey was slow and arduous. The trail, barely visible in some places, wound through thick undergrowth and over uneven terrain. As they made their way, Emily began to open up more, telling them about the night her family was taken. She described a man with a scarred face and cold, dark eyes. He had come out of nowhere, attacking without warning. Her father had tried to fight him off, but the man was too strong. The group listened in horror, their determination to protect Emily growing with each detail. They knew they had to reach civilization and report what had happened, but the sense of being watched never left them. The forest, once a place of beauty and tranquility, now felt like a labyrinth designed to ensnare them. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat and humidity were stifling, making the trek even more grueling. They paused only briefly to drink water and catch their breath, always conscious of the unseen danger that might be lurking nearby. As they approached a narrow ravine, they heard a sudden rustling in the underbrush. Everyone froze, their hearts pounding. Ethan motioned for silence and crept forward to investigate. He parted the bushes carefully, only to find a deer staring back at him. Relief washed over the group, but it was short-lived. Just as they were about to move on, a low, menacing voice echoed through the trees. "You can't hide forever," it taunted. Panic surged through them. The man was close, too close. They had to move, and fast. Ethan led them in a new direction, hoping to throw the pursuer off their trail. They moved as quickly and quietly as they could, but the forest seemed to conspire against them. Branches snagged their clothes, and the thick undergrowth slowed their progress. The sense of being hunted grew stronger with every step. As they pushed on, they came across an old, abandoned cabin. It looked as if it had been deserted for years, its windows boarded up and the roof partially caved in. Desperation drove them inside, seeking a momentary refuge. The cabin was dark and musty, filled with cobwebs and decaying furniture. They barricaded the door and windows as best they could, hoping the flimsy structure would hold. Emily, exhausted and scared, huddled in a corner with Sarah. Mark and Tom stood guard by the door, their makeshift weapons ready. Ethan searched the cabin for anything useful. In a dusty old chest, he found a rusted hunting knife and a few tarnished bullets, but no gun. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. He handed the knife to Mark, who nodded grimly. Time dragged on as they waited in the stifling cabin. The forest outside was unnervingly quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects eerily absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. Just as they began to hope the man had lost their trail, they heard the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. The group tensed, their hearts racing. The doorknob rattled and a shadow passed by the boarded-up windows. Ethan motioned for silence, and they held their breath, praying the man would move on. But the footsteps stopped right outside the door, and a low, chilling laugh echoed through the cabin. "You can't hide from me," the voice said, filled with cruel amusement. The door shuddered as the man began to pound on it, trying to force his way in. Panic surged through the group. They had to act, and quickly. Ethan grabbed a heavy piece of wood, ready to defend them with everything he had. They knew they couldn't hold out much longer. The thin walls of the cabin wouldn't protect them for long. With a final desperate effort, they braced themselves for the inevitable confrontation, hoping against hope that they could outsmart their pursuer and make it out alive. The cabin door creaked and groaned under the relentless assault. The man outside was determined, and it was only a matter of time before the barricade gave way. Ethan, Mark, and Tom positioned themselves around the entrance, ready to defend Emily and Sarah with everything they had. Their makeshift weapons seemed pitifully inadequate against the danger lurking outside, but there was no turning back now. The pounding on the door intensified, each blow sending splinters flying from the frame. Ethan could see the strain on Sarah's face as she clung to Emily, trying to shield her from the impending violence. The little girl was trembling, her eyes wide with fear. They had to protect her at all costs. With a final ear-splitting crash, the door burst open, sending debris scattering across the floor. The man stepped into the cabin, his scarred face twisted into a malevolent grin. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the room, taking in the terrified faces before him. Ethan lunged forward, swinging the heavy piece of wood with all his might. The man dodged effortlessly, his movements unnervingly fluid. Mark and Tom joined the fray, their attacks wild and desperate. The confined space of the cabin turned into a chaotic battleground, the air filled with the sounds of grunts, crashes, and the thud of blows landing. The man seemed almost inhumanly strong, easily parrying their attacks and striking back with brutal efficiency. He grabbed Tom by the collar and threw him across the room, where he landed with a sickening thud against the wall. Mark swung the rusted knife, but the man caught his wrist mid-strike and twisted, forcing Mark to drop the weapon with a cry of pain. Ethan was the last one standing between the man and the others. He swung the piece of wood again, aiming for the man's head, but the assailant sidestepped and delivered a crushing blow to Ethan's midsection. The air rushed out of Ethan's lungs as he collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The man turned his attention to Sarah and Emily. Sarah stood protectively in front of the girl, her eyes blazing with defiance despite the fear. The man took a step forward, his grin widening. "You can't save her," he sneered. But just as he reached out to grab Emily, there was a loud crash from outside. The distraction was enough for Ethan to muster his remaining strength. He surged forward, tackling the man and driving him into the ground. They struggled fiercely, each trying to gain the upper hand. In the chaos, Sarah spotted the hunting knife lying on the floor where Mark had dropped it. She snatched it up and, with a desperate cry, plunged it into the man's side. He roared in pain, his grip on Ethan loosening just enough for Ethan to break free. Mark, recovering from his fall, joined in, helping Ethan subdue the injured man. Bleeding and enraged, the man lashed out wildly, but his strength was waning. Together, Ethan and Mark managed to restrain him, pinning him to the ground. The fight drained from the man as he realized he was beaten. He glared up at them with hatred in his eyes, but he could no longer pose a threat. Breathing heavily, Ethan looked around the cabin. Tom was starting to stir, groaning in pain but alive. Sarah clutched Emily tightly, tears streaming down her face. The danger had passed, but the trauma of the encounter hung heavy in the air. They quickly bound the man's hands and feet with whatever they could find, making sure he couldn't escape. As they caught their breath and tried to process what had just happened, they knew they couldn't stay in the cabin. They had to get back to civilization, report the incident, and ensure the man was brought to justice. With the immediate threat neutralized, they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave. The forest, still silent and oppressive, seemed to watch them as they emerged from the cabin. Ethan and Mark carried the bound man, who glared at them with smoldering hatred. Tom, though injured, was determined to stay on his feet, supported by Sarah. Emily clung to Sarah, her small hand gripping tightly, as if letting go would bring the nightmare back. As they stepped outside, the forest loomed around them, dark and silent. The trees seemed to whisper, their branches rustling softly in the wind. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. They moved cautiously, their senses on high alert. The path they had taken to the cabin now felt like a labyrinth designed to confuse and entrap them. Ethan took the lead, scanning the forest for any signs of movement. The man they had captured remained silent, his eyes darting around as if calculating his next move. The group's pace was slow, hindered by their injuries and the need to keep their prisoner under control. The trek was arduous. They had no clear direction, relying on their instincts and fragmented memories to guide them. Hours passed, and the weight of exhaustion pressed down on them. Tom's injuries were taking a toll, and he stumbled frequently, each step a struggle. Sarah and Emily stayed close, their presence providing a small measure of comfort. As night began to fall, the temperature dropped, and the forest grew even more foreboding. They knew they couldn't stop. The danger of being lost in the wilderness was too great. The possibility that the man might have accomplices lurking nearby added to their urgency. They finally reached a clearing and, to their relief, found an old dirt road. It was a sign of civilization, a lifeline that could lead them to safety. They followed the road, their spirits lifted by the hope that they were on the right track. However, their relief was short-lived. A truck's headlights appeared in the distance, and they quickly realized it was heading towards them. Panic set in. They had no way of knowing if the approaching vehicle was friend or foe. They hid off to the side of the road, crouching low behind some bushes, hearts pounding. The truck slowed down as it neared their hiding spot. The tension was palpable as they waited, holding their breath. The truck stopped, and a man stepped out, flashlight in hand. He scanned the area, and for a moment it seemed he might find them. But then he turned and called out, "Hey, I found them!" Ethan's heart sank. This wasn't a rescue. More of the assailants' allies had arrived. Before they could react, more men appeared, surrounding them. They were outnumbered and outmatched. The captured man smirked, a malicious gleam in his eye as he realized his comrades had come for him. A scuffle ensued, but the group's exhaustion and injuries made resistance futile. The men quickly overpowered them, binding their hands and forcing them into the truck. Emily cried out, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Sarah tried to console her, but fear gripped them all. As they were driven deeper into the forest, a chilling realization set in. They were being taken to a place far from any chance of rescue. The truck stopped at a remote location, and they were dragged out, forced to kneel in the dirt. The leader of the group stepped forward, a sinister smile on his face. He looked at the captured man and then at the group, shaking his head in mock pity. He raised his hand, signaling one of his men. In a tragic turn of events, the man pulled out a gun, aiming it at the group. Shots rang out in the still night air. One by one they fell, unable to escape their fate. Emily's screams echoed through the forest as she clung to Sarah, the last sounds of their desperate struggle. In the end, the darkness of the forest claimed them, their lives cut short by the cruelty of those who wished to keep their secrets buried. The forest returned to its eerie silence, the only witnesses to the tragedy the trees and the shadows that had hidden their peril. The next day, a search party found the cabin, now empty and abandoned. The clues they uncovered told a harrowing tale, but it was too late to save the brave souls who had fought so hard to survive. The forest kept its secrets, and the memory of the lost group became a somber legend, a reminder of the dangers that lurked in the depths of the unknown wilderness.